Hi, in this video we're going to learn how to install and configure a boot manager, and specifically GRUB. We have discussed GRUB in a previous video on managing the boot sequence. However, this time we'll take a closer look at, again, installing and configuring GRUB. Now GRUB works in three stages: Stage 1, Stage 1.5, and Stage 2. A rather odd way to designate especially the second stage, 1.5. Partly, I think, it's because not every system is configured to use stage 1.5. There are some installations that will skip straight from stage 1 to stage 2. It doesn't really concern us all that much, and it's not going to make much of a difference for the LPI exam. Stage 1 is a file stored in the MBR. MBR is Master Boot Record, also known as the superblock. It's the first area for data on any hard drive. It's a very small area, and its only real task is to contain enough information to identify itself to any bootloader of any system, of any software system that takes a look at this hard drive. So the superblock, or the MBR, contains information about the file system type, the size of the hard drive, its status, and some other metadata structures that are related to this particular hard drive. If the bootloader is satisfied that the information is bootable, the hard drive is bootable based on this information, it will proceed to boot. If this operating system we're talking about is a Linux operating system, then the MBR will also contain a very small file called GRUB Stage 1. All it does is transfer the bootloader from BIOS, the bootload sequence I should say, from BIOS over to either stage 1.5 or stage 2. Stage 1.5 is located above the MBR, in other words beyond the small data area of the MBR, but still in the first 30 kilobytes of the hard drive, of that first partition on that hard drive. Stage 1.5 will contain any drivers needed to load Stage 2. Stage 2 is where the decisions are made that will allow the booting of the full operating system. And Stage 2 is also a piece of software. It's stored somewhere in a disk partition. It could really be anywhere because it's identified and located by Stage 1 or Stage 1.5, but it will present the user with a graphical menu that will include choices. Would you like to load this operating system, this revision of this operating system, or perhaps a previous revision, or perhaps you want to recover from some problem, from some catastrophic disaster in a previous session, and you want to load in safe mode, that is without a lot of drivers that can complicate things. So you want to install GRUB, or at least you'd like to have GRUB installed. In any operating system, or in any Linux distribution especially, the boot system, the boot manager will be installed at the very beginning of the installation process. It happens automatically. It happens whether you like it or not. Still, there might be some scenario where you have an operating system that's up and running, but you want to install GRUB. Perhaps you want to update from a previous version of GRUB, GRUB 1, or from Lilo. Or perhaps something became corrupted among the GRUB files and you want to reinstall. So in order to do that, the LPI exam expects that you should know how to install GRUB. There are two steps. Let's say you're using Fedora, the Fedora Linux distribution, which uses an RPM file management system, or a package management system actually. That's the way in Fedora systems they download and manage their software packages. So in order to first find out if GRUB is already installed on your system, you type RPM-Q, Q probably stands for query, GRUB, and that will return nothing if there's no GRUB installed, or the version and status of the GRUB if it is installed. If it's not installed, you'll want to install it. There's a special command for that, grub-install, and you follow that with the device or the partition where you'd like it installed. In, let's say, you'd like it installed to dev, which is a directory which contains references to all of your hardware hard drives in the system, all the partitions in the system. So dev/SDA, which would mean GRUB would install itself to the first hard drive on your system. That's how you install GRUB. I think the LPI will be satisfied with that. Now you have to learn how to configure GRUB. There are two ways to do that. One, when you boot, as you're booting into GRUB, you'll sometimes be presented with this menu. If you're not configured to have the menu show up during the boot sequence, you can call it during the boot sequence by hitting the right shift key as you're loading early in the boot sequence, soon after having left BIOS, but before you actually get to loading the major drivers. Hitting the right shift key will get you into the GRUB menu. So once you're in the GRUB menu, as we mentioned previously, you can highlight any one of the choices, any particular revision of the distribution you'd like to load. You can hit the letter E on your keyboard and edit the line item. However, if you're already up and running in the operating system in Linux, you also have the option of doing more robust editing of the GRUB system by opening the GRUB configuration file. Now, this gets a little confusing because there are lots of different GRUB configuration files. It depends which operating system, which distribution of Linux you're using. So, for instance, on a Fedora system, GRUB will be found at boot grub grub.conf. On SUSE Linux systems, Debian, and Ubuntu before GRUB 2, when it was still using GRUB 1, you find the configuration file at boot grub menu.last, LST. On modern Ubuntu systems, where they're using GRUB 2, you'll find the configuration file at boot grub grub.cfg. CFG stands for configure. However, the very top of that file, the first thing you'll see is these words. It is automatically generated by grub make config using templates from etc. grub.d and settings from etc. default grub. In other words, don't touch grub.cfg. It's an automatically generated file. If you want to mess around with the configuration of GRUB in more recent distributions of Ubuntu, use etc. grub.d and etc. default grub. So what can you configure? What is available? What variables are available to you? Well, you can configure the color of the GRUB menu when it comes up, or the color of the text in the GRUB menu. I honestly never saw that as a big deal, but the LPI exam does. It seems to think it is a big deal, and I think they make sure to ask you something about it in pretty much every exam. You can also configure the default distribution to run, and that's hugely important. Not only the default distribution, like would you want Ubuntu, or if you have a dual boot system, Ubuntu, or you'd like to boot Fedora by default, or you'd like to boot SUSE Linux by default, or a particular revision of Ubuntu by default. So you get to set what will load by default if you don't change the configuration in the meantime. The timeout you can configure, that is how long the menu will show up if you don't enter any particular preference. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. And the GFX menu. So that's the graphic menu that can accompany GRUB. These are variables that you have the option of editing while you're in these configuration files. Now, once you finish editing your GRUB files for your preferred configuration, you have to update the GRUB system so it's aware of your preferences. In Ubuntu, you run the tool update-grub. Let's take a look at an actual GRUB file. We're going to look at a Ubuntu grub.cfg file, the one you don't configure, you don't edit yourself, but that you find in the boot/grub directory. And we're not going to look at the whole file, it's big and unwieldy, but we'll take a look at certain parts of it using the magic of grep. So let's take a look at this file, and we'll grep the file for any reference to color. And we see two lines the two lines where you would have, or where the specific color scheme of the GRUB menu would be defined. Let's take a look again at default. And one more time, we'll see what the setting is for timeout. Now, for an exercise, a homework exercise, if you feel up to it, take a look at your own GRUB menu, and again, if you feel up to it, make a couple of small edits and save and update appropriately for your distribution. And then boot again the next time you happen to boot into your system. See what the changes were, see how the changes actually played out in the real world as they booted. Now it's time for our review quiz. Where is the GRUB Stage 1 file stored? On the MBR, in boot/GRUB, in the first 30 kilobytes of the SDA, or in a very safe place? Again, where is the GRUB Stage 1 file stored? And the answer is, it's stored in the MBR, the master boot record, the very first part, the very first section of the main hard drive, also known as the superblock.